Why is intervention, particularly early intervention, so important? The answer is brain plasticity, which is the brain's ability to change, reorganize, and even develop more efficient pathways for processing information. Research into the neurological basis of reading disorders, for example, has shown that educational and cognitive strategies can reroute brain networks, and the brain can reorganize to overcome reading obstacles. I'm so excited about our guest today who's going to talk to us all about early intervention. My guest is Dr. Tania Abouezzeddine. She's a licensed clinical neuropsychologist and is a full-time faculty member at Rosemead School of Psychology at Biola University. Dr. Abouezzeddine and I work together at UCLA's Semel Institute for Neuroscience, and she specializes in the cognitive assessment of children and adolescents with neurodevelopmental disorders, as well as cognitive impairments related to traumatic brain injury or other medical conditions. I'm so excited that she's here with me today. Let's dig in.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Dr. Abouezzeddine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. It's lovely to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. It's been a while since we've connected, and I've just been eager to have you on because of so many conversations that we've had over our years of working together, from UCLA to private practice, and all the little kiddos that we have worked on in cases and helped parents better understand why they're struggling, and wrote reports and made recommendations to help them thrive in their environment. So I was eager to have you come back.
Thank you. Thank you for this privilege. I'm really excited to help.
Wonderful. And I know that we've been talking a lot about intervention and why it's important. And I wanted to do an episode on intervention because I think a lot of it is kind of a mystery to a lot of people in terms of why it works and how it works. But I feel like we need to kind of go back up a bit and really understand why it's important to understand why a child is struggling before the intervention, because the diagnosis or even the reason for the difficulty determines the type of intervention, right? And the intensity of that intervention. So I thought maybe we should start by, revisiting, why it's important to understand the reason why a child is struggling and to have a diagnosis if that's appropriate.
Yes, I think that's a very good place to start. I think any good intervention starts with a proper diagnosis and a proper assessment.
Absolutely. And I know that you've said this before because I've watched talks that you've given. And you said the point is not to make a diagnosis. The point is not to label. And it's not about categorizing kids into labels. So why is it important to have a good assessment? Because there's a lot of inadequate assessments I've seen, and there's a lot of misdiagnosis when we miss things. But why is it important to have a really good assessment?
And I'm really grateful for that question. I think when we're thinking about how to understand what's going on with the child that we're helping, we need to make sure that we're seeing the child through an accurate lens. So it's not so much about providing a label, but correctly understanding the patterns that we're seeing. And so a good assessment requires someone who understands the child clinically, emotionally, takes into account the context that the child is coming from. And something that I usually will tell my students when I teach on this topic is that having a correct holistic understanding of our patient or our child. The reason for that is that the negative outcome or what the horrible things that can happen when you misdiagnose or when you miss certain patterns can be really detrimental to the success of that child, as well as the success of any intervention that's thrown into that child's lap. I don't know if you want me to get into those kind of outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that we've probably both seen that where kids get diagnosed as being behavioral problems, or not even diagnosed, they get labeled as being a behavioral problem when in fact there's ADHD or there's anxiety. I'd love for you to give some examples of that. That's really helpful.
So it's actually quite common, and it's really quite sad because you actually see these patterns specifically with a certain portion of society. But yes, a lot of times because of these childhood disorders having behavioral symptoms, these children are more likely to be labeled with behavioral problems like oppositional defiant disorder, or to get labels like being difficult or to have conduct disorder. And the problem with these labels is that they stick with that child and they impact what kind of services that child ends up receiving, as well as how his or her population or help teachers, people who are providing intervention, begin to actually perceive them. And so there's a lot of negative impact because of that. So I'll give you a specific example because I know we're kind of talking in this kind of vague way. So just to kind of become a little bit more concrete about things. We know from research, actually, and there's a recent article that was published only 2 years ago now, that shows that minority boys, for example, African American, or sorry, Black boys and Hispanic boys who have ADHD are highly unlikely to be given an ADHD diagnosis compared to their non-white, so their white non-Hispanic counterparts. They are more likely to be given labels such as oppositional defiant and conduct disorder to explain their behavior. When a misdiagnosis occurs, such as this, it leads to really awful negative trajectories. So the likelihood of this child receiving services decreases. The likelihood of this child succeeding in school decreases. And a lot of these children end up either dropping out of school, or they may finish up school but not pursue higher education, which is really correlated with a lot of other negative outcomes. So that's kind of like a big picture example of what happens when the incorrect assessment is done and an incorrect diagnosis is made.
Absolutely. And I've seen that literature as well. And I've seen it in my clinical practice where, kids come in late because they weren't identified early on. And you also see it, you gave a really good example about ADHD, but, it happens in reading as well. And that's one of the reasons why early intervention is so important, is to identify those difficulties early on, because it does, like you said, it impacts the trajectory of a child's life. And we know that there are effective interventions, but if kids never get the intervention, they don't have an opportunity to benefit from those interventions.
And with reading, it's so crucial because we exist in societies where reading is the mechanism of learning. And so if you have a child who never really kind of grasps that tool, then they're in these educational systems where they're just getting more and more frustrated. And the other outcome is that they start to think really horribly about themselves, which increases the risk of depression, increases the risk of anxiety. And these children then get set on this trajectory of failure. And I know that not all of life is academic, but we live in societies where this is how these kids enter into successful life. Getting a suitable education, knowing how to read, is going to open doors to jobs and other opportunities that they would miss out on because someone didn't catch their disability early enough. And reading disorder is a perfect example of this, because reading disorder if it's not intervened on early enough, that child continues to have a gap of reading ability that will stick with them for the rest of their life. And that is a huge tragedy. And so this is the thing about critical time of intervention. So for reading disorders, if you don't intervene by like age 8, that child will continue to have fluency, accuracy, and maybe comprehension problems in reading that will be hard to close the gap compared to children who are normal readers.
Absolutely. And we have the ability to identify kids who are at risk for having those reading difficulties early on. You know, if there's a family history of dyslexia, if there were speech and language issues early on, we know from the research that those kids are at greater risk for having a reading disorder, for having dyslexia. So we have the opportunity to intervene, to screen those kids, intervene early. Because, you know, one of the things that Sally Shaywitz says is that the preschooler who can't quite learn her letters becomes the 6-year-old who can't match sounds to letters. And by age 11, that child would rather hide in the bathroom than read out loud in class, right? And so, like you're saying, it's not just academics. It's going to have a social emotional toll, and it decreases the ability of that child to access learning. Because, like you said, in this society, we need to read to learn.
We need to read to learn, and we need to read to be able to attain those higher echelons of education as well. And you know, in terms of genetics, like for reading disorders, it's 91% heritable. That means that there is evidence of this disorder in family lines. And a lot of times this is missed because maybe someone doesn't ask, or because maybe family members weren't disclosing of having said reading disorders. And so that's why the clinical interview becomes really important. You have to ask those parents if they have, if this is a child who lives with their biological parents, being able to kind of unpack that genetic history can help reveal that disorder.
Right. And so many times parents will say that they were never diagnosed. So they don't actually have that label or have that understanding that it was a learning. They may have just said, you know, reading was always hard for me, or I never liked to read. And then if you unpack it more, you'll see that there were some struggles early on, but they compensated for a long time. Or they got into other fields where they didn't rely so much on reading, right?
Exactly. Yeah, they self-selected into fields where it wasn't really pushing up against their area of weakness. And this is, again, going back to your initial question as to why a good assessment is necessary. A good assessment means that you know how to ask those questions. Because just saying, is there anyone in your family who's been diagnosed with a reading disability, will probably not get you the answer you need. And so knowing how to ask, knowing how to detect the patterns of the disorder in the family genetics becomes also an important part of the assessment.
Right. So after parents have had a good assessment and they know why their child is struggling, this is due to dyslexia, this is due to ADHD, this is due to a language disorder, and we now are in the position to put in place a good intervention. Do interventions change the brain? And in what way? I know it's going to differ depending on the type of intervention, but what do we know about the importance of early intervention? I know we could probably talk for another hour and a half on this alone.
Yes.
But how important is it, and why is it important?
So I'll try to be simple and succinct. So it's really important. And we actually have evidence and research now to show that you can change the brain through good, consistent, intense intervention. And those terms are actually important. So, for example, the Shaywitz article that you referred to, or Shaywitz, who's an awesome researcher in reading disorders, she talks about 80 hours of intense intervention that need to be provided in order to start changing the brain pathways that have to do with reading ability. And it's 80 hours within a very short period of time. So we're not talking about 1 hour a week. We're not even talking about sometimes 1 hour a day. We're talking about that brain being trained just like we train our muscles when we exercise within a very short period of time in a very intense way. And again, when you image those brains after the intervention, the neuronal pathways related to reading have now been changed. So you actually see a positive outcome as a result of an external intervention, like working on their fluency, sight words, comprehension, phonics. We also see findings like this with ADHD. So children who receive consistent, intense, for example, executive functioning training, um, when you image their brains pre-intervention and post-intervention, many of these kids have actually more myelination on the neuronal pathways that are in the frontal lobe. So this again is showing that there's brain change that is occurring as a result of the intervention.
Right. So we're not just, and I think it's so important for parents and educators to understand that we're not just, doing these interventions to improve reading scores. We're actually doing these interventions and changing pathways in the brain, the efficiency with which kids process information that they take in, which allows them to interpret information more quickly, to make those sound symbol associations more efficiently, and that enhances learning.
It does. And it does change their brain neuronal pathways. And so for those parents, what's really encouraging to hear is that, yes, it's a lot of effort and that child will be tired. Exercising your brain is really exhausting work. But the outcome, a few months down the road, a year or two down the road, is actually going to be visible change in that child's ability. And like you said, every intervention is a little bit different. There are interventions that are more supported by research than others. And also, it has to do with how old you are as a child when you start and how complicated your case is. So, as a parent, looking at another kid who's had ADHD, like your kid, and who's getting services, but they're getting better faster, that could be discouraging. And I totally understand that. But understanding that every brain is working at its own pace, but will improve. And the capacity of improvement will be dependent on severity of the disorder.
Yes, and severity is so important because maybe some kids don't need the intervention for as long as others. And it's also important to also think, when you talked about the importance of getting a good assessment, so many kids who have one disorder meet criteria for another disorder, right? So there's a lot of what we call, in the clinical world, comorbidity, right? Co-occurring disorders where kids with dyslexia also have ADHD. And that's important because it also speaks to the timing of these interventions. Because if you have a kiddo who really needs that intense intervention for reading, but they also have severe ADHD, they're going to have a hard time sitting for 4 hours a day unless you address the ADHD first.
That's right. And that's why, and I'm so glad you mentioned that. And it's actually not unusual that comorbidity occur. I can't pull out the statistic right now, but there's a really high comorbidity.
I think it's 40 to 50%.
Yeah, between 40 and 50%. That's right. With ADHD and reading disorders. And you're right, it has to be tailored to what it is that you're looking at. So if you have a child who has more severe ADHD symptoms, handling those first and then easing into a reading intervention would be wise. And again, that's why assessment needs to be tailored and intervention needs to be tailored to that specific child. There's no one formula that's going to fit every single kid the same way.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. And I think about the importance of intervention, appropriate intervention, evidence-based intervention, because I think one of the things that we do, and we've talked about this before, is sometimes parents or educators jump to the intervention before you understand why kids are struggling. And and it's a knee-jerk reaction. You want your child to do well, and they're struggling in school, so you get them a tutor. But the tutor is not going to address the underlying issue if you don't understand, again, the reason for the struggle.
Yes, and it's not only the parents understanding, but depending on the age of the child also needs to understand, because unless they are invested within their ability of being invested in this, the better the intervention is going to be, right? And that's the other thing about having a lot of cool interventions out there with a lot of bells and whistles. A lot of times I see in the clinic that parents will pursue things that may be really shiny, but don't necessarily have robust research behind them. And so they end up spending a lot of resources and getting discouraged. And the risk with that is that that child loses steam and gets discouraged. Because then they're like, I've done this for 2 years now and I haven't gotten better. What's the point? Well, but the intervention was not appropriate. And now you've lost that child's engagement. And like I said, the other comorbidities with these disorders would be emotional disorders. So now you have a child who potentially is depressed, and it would be even harder to get them to become engaged in treatment.
Absolutely. And then you've also lost critical time. You mentioned those critical windows of development. If you spend a year on just tutoring without understanding that it's a dyslexia, or understanding that this is ADHD that's causing the problems with focus to get the work done, then you've missed an opportunity to really provide the appropriate intervention that the child needs.
And I see this all the time because one of the populations I serve is young undergrads in college who have not been diagnosed yet. And their parents may have provided tutoring. They may have homeschooled them to slow down their educational curriculum, but now they're in college and they still can't read on their own. And honestly, it's tragic because you have these very intelligent, a lot of times these really smart kids, but they have this disability that now that critical window is gone. And it becomes all about scaffolding to allow them to try to bridge that gap. But for the rest of their life, they are now at a huge disadvantage.
Right. And they're going to struggle more than the child who becomes an adult but had an intervention early on.
Yes, because the child who had the intervention early on, that scaffold has become more innate, and they know that in some ways they can succeed, versus this younger adult who's in their early 20s, or maybe they're 19-year-old, now thinks that they're just not smart enough. So what's the point?
And like you said, when you have the appropriate intervention, and if we use the example of reading, they have an opportunity to develop those pathways, to strengthen those pathways so that their brains actually look more like kids who do not have dyslexia, because they're using the same pathways now when they weren't before. And it's so interesting because, I was consulting on a case a while back, and it was a 5-year-old with an early history of speech and language delays. And parents were right on it. They were just like, I know my child has these risk factors. We have a history of reading struggles. My child had difficulties with speaking and speech and articulation early on. He's going to be going to kindergarten. We want to have a good handle on where he is. And sure enough, those early indicators for reading were low compared to everything else. And I just thought, this is what we want. I would love for every 5-year-old who has risk factors like that and can get a screen. They don't even need a full assessment to get a reading screen, because you can intervene early on to help with the acquisition of phonological processing. And imagine the trajectory of that child compared to, if the parents hadn't brought them in until like 6th grade because they didn't have an understanding of the link between speech and reading.
That's right. And sometimes, and I don't know if you see this, I see this in the clinic quite often, is that parents also are afraid to know. And that fear is what prevents them from getting that early assessment and pursuing that early intervention. And so a lot of times it's parents who don't want their kids to have a reading disorder and they don't want their kids to have ADHD, which I totally understand.
I completely understand that as well. It's a fear of labeling. So many people are afraid of the label, but I try to emphasize, and like you said, and you said so beautifully before, it's not about the label. It's not about the diagnosis. It's about, why is my child spending 3 hours on a 30-minute homework assignment? Why is he struggling with reading more than his peers? That's what we want to know.
Why is he always studying and it doesn't show up in his grades? Why can his peers go out and be playing and interacting socially, and all he's doing is homework and feeling worse and worse about himself? And, it really is also about understanding your kids' strengths. And I think that's something that comes up a lot when we talk to parents, right? Is that we talk to them about, these are the areas that they're struggling with, but these are the areas that they're really good at. And that conversation needs to be happening in the very beginning, because as you're intervening with the areas that are weak, shoring up that child's perception of him or herself is really important. Making that child understand that, yes, they may struggle with reading, but they are really creative. They're really kind. They're really social, because they're going to need to kind of borrow from these positive buckets to be able to keep pumping energy into these other areas that are harder for them. And again, this is why early assessment and intervention is important, because that's when you catch the child before they become jaded. And becoming jaded is actually quite common.
Yes. And that's where you get the anxiety kicking in. That's where you get
Yes.
depression and a poor self-concept, because I love that you mentioned the strengths, because a lot of times these kids don't see their strengths. All they see is their struggle. They don't see that they're an amazing artist or a gifted athlete or a great friend, or they're good at math, even though they struggle with reading, or they've got great problem-solving skills.
Yeah, and parents also, that's why parents are worried about labeling, is because they don't want us to see their children just from this label lens. And so a good assessment is supposed to help all aspects of this child flourish and come to light from an early enough age where you're supporting them in both the areas that they're strong in as well as the areas that they're weak in.
Yes, and that identification of strengths is important, because it also helps guide the intervention. Because if you're making recommendations, you can help use that child's strengths to help them compensate for areas of weakness. But if you don't know what the strengths are, then it's hard to kind of know what you can leverage to help the child moving forward.
You see that when children receive cookie cutter interventions. This unfortunately happens a lot in school interventions, where all the kids who have specific weaknesses go through the exact same program. And there's no catered intervention that speaks into their areas of specific strengths and weakness.
And that's why it's important to look at the child as a whole. And when we do that, what does that look like when we look at a child as a whole?
Yeah. So pediatric neuropsychologists are known for having horribly large batteries.
Yes.
And right, like it feels sometimes that we're giving every single test. And I try to explain to the parents that the reason for that is because we want to get a holistic perception of that child's cognitive, emotional, and social ability, and physical as well, right? Sensory ability. And so what it looks like is giving a more extensive battery, not just a few tests in there to look at the areas that I think may be weak, but actually I'm giving tests that I think will capture some of this child's strengths. So when I'm providing feedback to that family and potentially to that child, I can say things like, you know what, your written creativity is pretty awesome. You just have a really hard time organizing your thoughts, or you have a really hard time sustaining your attention, or have a hard time with impulse control. But look how great your visual spatial ability is. If I give you something to copy, look how great that strength is. Look how good your language ability is, right? And so I can then balance my feedback to that child. So they're not just hearing something is broken, they're hearing my brain works in this way. And in order for me to do well in school, I just need more support in this area. But all these other areas are good. That simple language brings that child in alignment, and helps them then become participators in their own success.
Right. And it brings them on board for the intervention, because you're not just taking them to this person who's going to help them. They understand why. They understand why they're going to see this person every week or for a few hours every week. And they know how it's going to help them. But they also know that the difficulty is not who they are.
Yes. And that actually is, again, I don't tend to be too succinct when I'm responding. That actually is the core of the message, that you may have this area of weakness, but that is not all of who you are. You're this wonderful human with all these strengths, but you happen to have this weakness that we can help you with. And that's a different way of helping that child think about themselves than saying you have ADHD, you have a reading disorder. Um, Even if those things may be accurate, they're not helpful in and of themselves.
Right. And yes, the identification of a disorder, a disability like ADHD or dyslexia is important because it guides the intervention. But again, we're looking at the whole child. We're looking at their strengths as well as their areas of weakness. And we're tailoring that intervention to not only the child's area of weakness, where they're struggling, why they're struggling, but also utilizing their strengths, which can be absolutely incredible. And that is so important because, like you said before, and we've talked about, is that when kids don't get the appropriate intervention and they experience failure and they get negative feedback from teachers, from their parents, and sometimes it doesn't have to be you're not working hard enough, although some kids do hear that. Sometimes it's just like, it's a sigh from a parent who's been sitting there for 3 hours. You know what I mean? And it's not intentional, but kids pick up on everything. And we want them to feel good about themselves. And when we intervene early, we can actually decrease the likelihood that they're going to develop anxiety and depression as a result of failure upon failure upon failure.
Yes. And again, I know that we've already touched on this, but I definitely see the children who come through on the other side who did not get diagnosed on time, and what that has now meant for them, where it's just become such a core part of their identity that there is something that they are just not good at and they want to quit. And so you see these bright children who just don't put the effort in anymore because what's the point? And they've internalized, and I hate to use this language because I don't agree with it, but they internalize this idea that they're broken in a way that cannot be fixed.
Right.
And that is tragic because as an adult, that self concept will lead to so many other negative outcomes.
And that's what we want to avoid, because we want kids to not only do well in school, it's not all about academics, but we want them to feel good about themselves and who they are and their position in society, and enjoy the learning experience and their interactions with their peers and the adults in their life.
And not to just see themselves again through that lens of, this is something that I'm just not good at. We are all not good at something, all of us. But the thing, again, like you've mentioned, with these disabilities, like with ADHD and with reading disorder, we now know how to help. We know how to help early, and we know how to help so that that gap of difference is minuscule. And so that's what makes it really sad, is that if it was caught early, if it was helped early, then it wouldn't have as much negative ramifications on the wholeness of who that child is.
Yes. And you talked about, working with college students, and I've taught it in the college system as well, and have seen something very similar with students who made it into college, got into college in that freshman year. They just can't make it. They can't struggle. The reading load is too much. I'm thinking about kids who struggle with reading where it wasn't identified. And imagine being a slow reader and having difficulty getting through the material. You can't finish important tests on time. You can't keep up the reading. And it affects your ability to reach your full potential, because that person who, if they got the right support, and even if they understood, so if they didn't get the intervention, they could get the accommodations that they need in order to help them through college, that can change their lives.
Hugely. And actually, the other caveat to some of this is sometimes I've had patients, or like young adults now, who have chosen majors that specifically tap into their area of weakness. So, for example, I had a more recent case where someone had a math disorder, but they really didn't want to quit, which was part of their awesome strength. But they picked engineering as a profession to pursue. Well, a good intervention early may have helped. A good assessment of their abilities early may have helped them decide on a more appropriate major. So again, the ramifications once you get older are just so large and can impact so many different aspects of your life.
Which is why our message is to identify early and intervene early for the best outcomes. We know the best outcomes are when you can identify the difficulty early and then you intervene early. The outcomes are better.
Yes, and with the intervention too, and I know that parents are exhausted and too tired sometimes to be able to do this, but to pursue interventions that have been shown to be helpful. Not just interventions that are freely available, or interventions that are kind of, again, like I said, bells and whistles, and someone is selling you on it being like the top of the line. Both of those are problematic. So do your research and make sure that they're getting the intervention that has been shown to help.
Absolutely. And if you're not sure, ask. There are a lot of clinicians who do free consultations. And even if you just are on the phone and say, this is what they're offering my child, we could do a search in, PubMed and find out if there's any research to support it and let you know.
Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that. I think a lot of times parents are actually unaware of what resources are available to them. Consultation with a professional is usually something that is provided at no cost or at minimal cost to parents. And I have this happen all the time where I may have parents come in with data that has been gathered up to that point, and they're not sure if they want to do a full-on assessment at this point, but I can look at that data. And for a very, very, very small fee, say, this is what you need to do next.
Yes. And I have a lot of parents who do that with school-based evaluations where, this is the assessment the school did. We're not ready for an assessment. And then we'll just do a consultation and we'll look through the data, see what it looks like. What does it reveal? And are the interventions that they're proposing appropriate to help my child?
That's right. And then we can help them. And I do this with my clients where I help them chart a plan. So for the next year, this is what I want you to do. And I sometimes, hopefully this doesn't sound weird, I will rank it for them. So I'll say, you do this first, you do this second, third, just so that they know where to invest their energy, their time, and their money.
Yes, it's all about prioritizing, because sometimes, particularly with complex kiddos, it's hard to do everything all at once. And it can be exhausting for the child and, financially, not something that's possible for parents. But, if we can kind of prioritize where should we start? We use the example of the ADHD and the reading issue. Well, we have to address the attention first because we want them to be able to pay attention while doing the intervention for reading, right?
That's right. Because then what's the point? It's just wasted resource.
Dr. Abouezzeddine, thank you so much for being with us here today. Such great information that you shared for parents, for educators, for clinicians who are working with kiddos. If people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to reach you?
So there's a few ways. As you may have already noticed, my last name is a doozy. So that's not the best way to look me up. My website is pedsneurolaw.com. And that's also my Gmail. And that's spelled PEDSNEUROLA@gmail.com or .com if you're looking up the website.
Wonderful. And I'll be sure to put that information in the show notes. Again, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to talk with you. We probably could have talked for another 30 minutes, but we'll have to do it again in a different episode.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to help out with these topics.
Thanks so much for listening. I would love to keep in touch with you. And the best way for that to happen is for you to go to childnexus.com and sign up for our newsletter. You will get information about upcoming webinars, podcast episodes, town halls, and you'll be the first to know when we launch new Child Nexus programs. Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to tune in next week.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.